protests against the Israeli government's planned judicial overhaul are continuing today, only not in Israel. Hundreds are reportedly going to be taking part in a demonstration in the streets of London to make their voices heard. And organizers say that the protest is part of an international effort to prevent Israel from being turned into a non-democratic country. Well, joining us now from London is Dr. Sharon Shochat, the organizer of the Defend Israeli Democracy protest. So why do you think that it's necessary that these protests against the judicial reforms also take place abroad and not only here in Israel?
I think that the key message that we're trying to communicate today from London, from the protest that will take place in Parliament Square, is that Israelis abroad are standing in solidarity with the protesters in Israel, with our families and friends who are being branded anarchists. And this is one reason for us to echo those calls, in not just in London, but in other cities around the world. But the other reason is that we are calling on the local Jewish community, British Jews, to join us in this campaign and to basically support our struggle in Israel, where the community here is typically fearful of criticizing Israel. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing recently is a very big change in the tone of the local leaders of the community.
Now, Well, I actually want to ask you about that. Israelis, have a deeper understanding of what they're fighting against here, which they say is, of course, the government's planned overhaul of the judiciary. But are you worried that people who see this protest abroad are going to think that it's simply an anti-Israel protest and join in for other reasons? Because we are seeing other groups kind of align themselves with these protests. And do people in London understand the difference between protests against the government and Israel as a whole? Because I know that this week is not going to be the first protest that you guys have held so far.
That's true. I think that it will be very difficult to confuse a protest where hundreds of people are waving Israeli flags with an anti-Israel protest. I think it will be a very clear. The messages, the signs that people will be holding are calling for democracy, and the protest is held under the banner of Defend Israeli Democracy, and that's being communicated very clearly. I think not every person in London is probably aware of what's going on in Israel, but the local Jewish community and members of parliament, and these are our two major pressure groups, or the two key audiences that we're hoping to reach, obviously other than the one in Israel, they are aware. So they know what the protest is about, and I think the message will be very, very clear to them.
Now, anti-Semitism is, of course, rising across the world, specifically in London as well. How do you think these judicial reforms could impact the lives of Jews who are living in the diaspora?
I think the impacts on anti-Semitism will be huge. I think the community here is very much aware of it and is fearful of it. I was in an event earlier this week, that invited leaders of the Jewish community here in London to discuss the events in Israel and how it may impact the future relationship between the local Jewish community and Israel as the Jewish state. And the voices that we hear here are very much against what's going on, and not just opposing it, but also making clear statements in support of the protests from across the two big political parties here. So conservatives and supporters of the Labour Party within the Jewish community are both appalled about the ramifications that could be here for the local community. And we see Jewish communities around the world, from Australia to Japan, coming out with statements supporting the protests and speaking against the Israeli government and its actions. So I think what happens in Israel will impact every Jewish person wherever they are, and I think everyone knows that.
Has there been any pressure put on the UK government to get involved, and for the UK government to put pressure on the Israeli government regarding these protests? And what have we seen from the UK so far in terms of a response to these ongoing demonstrations?
So in the UK, the UK government hasn't yet made any clear statement, and we're working very hard to get voices in Parliament here to speak up. We do know that there are calls from members of Parliament to the government to speak, to be a lot more vocal. There are we are in touch with members of Parliament, and we are trying to come up with a letter similar to the one that came out in the US, where we saw 92 members of Congress in an appeal to President Biden to be a lot more vocal and express their concerns and objection to the Israeli government's actions and legislation. I'm confident that we are going to see a lot more done here by Parliament. There's one petition that we've spread and getting signatures from. There are at the moment ongoing discussions between the Israeli delegation and the UK delegation on the future of the trade agreement between the UK after leaving the European Union and Israel. We're hoping to put in place conditions in that agreement that will make sure that Israel stands by democratic rules and conditions.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. And it will certainly be interesting to see how many people turn up to your protest in London today.
All right. Expected to be the biggest outside of Israel so far. Thank you very much.